Okay, it's a minute or two after 4. So I want to welcome everyone who has joined us today for Growing Climate Solutions Path to Positive Southwest Florida Climate Compass Speaker Series. It's really great that you have taken time out of your day to become more engaged and more interested in climate issues regionally. Today, I have the great pleasure of having Dr. Sarah Cooley and Mr. J.P. Brooker from the Ocean Conservancy with us, and they are presenting an unequivocal and unprecedented climate change in the ocean. Next slide. I am Dr. Anna Pushkin-Shevlin. I'm the Regional Director of Growing Climate Solutions, and I'll be your moderator today. Let me tell you a little bit about the way we run the Climate Compass series. This session runs approximately 75 minutes. I'll do a brief introduction, and I try to keep it as brief as possible to give our fabulous speakers about 30 to 35, 40 minutes to present their information. And then I encourage a very lively and active question and answer period. All the participants are welcome to include questions in the chat function. I'll be monitoring the chat and trying to group the questions together. We'll try to answer them at the end. If it's something really burning, perhaps somebody will chime in and answer it for you on the chat. We are recording this presentation. So if you know somebody who had to miss it, or you're really engaged and want to share it with others, please look for the presentation. It will be posted on Growing Climate Solutions webpage under the resource tab in the coming days. We want to provide an interesting and active discussion, so don't be shy and ask your questions. Next. For those of you that are new to Growing Climate Solutions or may not have heard of us, Growing Climate Solutions Path to Positive is a network of diverse Southwest Florida institutions and stakeholders, businesses, civic organizations, faith groups, a variety of local constituents that are interested in engaging on the issue of climate and climate action. The focus is to build climate awareness in our community using proven communication and educational strategies. We tend to promote the protection of natural assets as a strategy for creating resilience, but we talk about everything. We want to engage and empower our community leaders, inspire them to make supportive decisions that will advance climate resilience in our region. We want the region to be prosperous and healthy. And to do that, we want many voices in the climate discussion. So we try to make our presentations and our programming inclusive and equitable so that we bring a just solution forward. And also, we focus on increasing the visibility of good climate action among our partners, because if they are doing the right thing, we want to celebrate that. We want to put it out there in the media so that we can become a model for others. Next, please. How does Growing Climate Solutions take on such a big mission? Through 3 principal activities. We work with our partners on projects. That can be hosting and gathering people for discussions. We do real hands-on stuff like tree planting initiatives with some of our partners. We provide supporting role in project management when they want to do something but don't know how. We produce a variety of electronic communications. We have a newsletter that goes out 6 times a year that talks about sustainability topics and climate topics. If you haven't signed up, please go to our website and sign up. We promise not to spam you. We also send out a monthly educational flyer that's a compilation of all kinds of educational opportunities in Southwest Florida from all of our partners. So if we're not doing something, perhaps one of our partner groups are. We try to put this out monthly so that our audience can continue to engage. And mostly we do educational programming like this series, the Southwest Florida Climate Compass. We have a daytime Why and How series that talks about sustainability actions. And I am available, and some of our speakers, to go out to your community or your business or your organization and talk about climate. So if you have an organization that's interested, please contact me after this presentation. Next. Most of all, I want to thank our founding partners. Growing Climate Solutions is an initiative of the Community Foundation of Collier County, the Collaboratory based in Fort Myers, the Conservancy of Southwest Florida, and Gulf Coast University. We also receive generous funding from the Kapnick Family Foundation. Next. And this series, the Climate Compass series, is sponsored by our media partners, the Naples Daily News and News Press, as well as WGCU, who have been very generous in offering us outreach and advertising the series to our community to engage a broader and wider audience. Next. So with that, I'm going to prime the pump for today's discussion and ask everybody who's on this call to take a moment and think about how they're experiencing climate. Most people think of it as, well, the days are getting warmer, or I notice that spring seems to come earlier all the time. But where we really see climate change happening and where we first noticed it was in the oceans, because 70% of the Earth's surface is covered with water. And the oceans have been absorbing about 90% of the heat and 30% of the carbon dioxide that's been emitted since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So our oceans have been our buffer for a long time, and we are seeing that impact in our oceans. And to learn more about that, we are really fortunate today to have the foremost experts on this topic. Next, please. I want to warmly welcome for today's conversation, Dr. Sarah Cooley and Mr. J.P. Brooker from the Ocean Conservancy. Sarah Cooley is the Director of Climate Sciences for the Ocean Conservancy based in Washington, D.C. She has a PhD in marine science, and her research has focused on the interdisciplinary ocean carbon cycle, science communication, and marine policy. But what's really impressive with us, she is one of the coordinating and leading authors of the Ocean and Coastal Systems chapter for Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change's 6th assessment, which was recently released. And she is a chapter author on the 5th national assessment. John Paul, J.P. Brooker, is the Florida Director for the Ocean Conservancy, which is based in St. Petersburg, right on our coast. He is a 6th-generation Floridian and trained as an environmental attorney. John has focused his work on federal fisheries policy, Florida water quality and climate issues, marine wildlife conservation, and eliminating marine debris from Florida's waters. He has been elected to the Executive Council of the Environmental and Land Use Law section of the Florida Bar, and has been appointed to the Coral Advisory Panel of the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council. I can't think of more knowledgeable and expert people to speak to us today. So let's warmly welcome Sarah and John.
Thank you, Anna. It's so nice to be here, and thank you to the audience for taking some of your day to hear us tell you a little bit about the ocean. Today we'll be talking about climate change in the ocean. As Anna mentioned, I have just completed working on one of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessment reports, which really gives us a holistic view of how climate change is impacting our ocean and coastal systems. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then JP will talk about what exactly is happening in Florida, especially at the policy level. Next slide, please. So climate is changing. There's no longer any question that climate is changing, and it's due to human activity. These are some quotes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that was released last year. And they used very strong language for this group. They said it's unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. And then they point out that the present state of many impacts are unprecedented over many centuries to thousands of years. Now, these reports are written by groups of hundreds of authors coming from around the world, interpreting thousands of pieces of information. And this actually winds up being very strong language from them. Unequivocal and unprecedented changes are really something to stop and take a closer look at. Next slide, please. So the report that I worked on that just came out a few weeks ago really looked at the impact on natural and human systems that climate change is having. And it also looked at the options we have to adapt to these changes. And the main high level takeaways from the media release in kind of a plain language form are reproduced here. And you can see that they really emphasize that, again, the scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. They also go on to point out that further delay in concerted action is going to miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a good future. And then they really point out also that action on adaptation has increased, but it's uneven and it's not happening fast enough. And the report goes on to evaluate the options that we can take in every region and every sector. But they also really wanted to underscore that the effectiveness is decreasing with increased warming. So the solution set really has to be both mitigation action to cut greenhouse gas emissions and adaptation action to help us live with a change that is inevitable. Next slide, please. So thinking about climate impacts in Florida, we know that there are climate impacts everywhere. The ocean is experiencing these impacts as well as the land. In addition, we have heavy human uses overlapping. So according to the state of Florida, its beaches and nearshore coastal waters draw more than 33 million tourists to the state each year. And that contributes more than $56 billion a year and more than 900,000 jobs to the economy. The natural environment is also a way of life for Florida as well. That's harder to put a number on, but it's really an inseparable piece of why we love the state. Next slide, please. You've probably already heard and thought about heat waves on land, but marine heat waves are an emerging threat. So this picture is actually from the US 4th National Climate Assessment from 2018, which found that by 2050, a lot of places in Florida will experience from 50 to over 150 nights whose minimum temperature is above 75 degrees. Minimum night temperature is actually turning out to be a really good index of overall warming and overall comfort. So prolonged heat waves are going to be placing stress on natural and human systems. High humidity hazards are also growing, and that poses an additional danger for living beings by preventing them from cooling down effectively. In the ocean, we've documented increasing marine heat waves, which are shown here. The latest international climate report that I participated in shows that marine heat waves are getting more frequent and more intense. These marine heat waves can kick off mass mortality events in coral reefs, seagrasses, mangroves, and other ocean environments. In 2015 and 2016, you might have heard about the extensive severe coral bleaching that affected more than 30% of corals off the Southeast United States. Marine heat waves are projected to increase, and the largest increases in the frequency and coverage of these heat waves are projected for the Gulf of Mexico, the US southern east coast, as well as the US Pacific Northwest. Next slide, please. So on land, we see a lot of converging drivers. We see wildfires. The extent of warmer and drier conditions that are favorable for wildfires has increased, and it's projected to increase more. Not only do wildfires burn sensitive inland systems, but they're also burning sensitive coastal ecosystems, and they add ash and debris to coastal waterways, and they substantially change surface runoff patterns over time. We find that wildfire years also correspond to decreased tourism revenues. At the same time, we're also seeing more drought and flood events. You've probably heard that under climate change, wet areas will become wetter and dry areas will become drier, and that's all true. Drought conditions are increasing across the country, and rain events are more severe. Increasing drought is also forcing us to pull out more groundwater from under the surface to use for irrigation and drinking. So according to the state of Florida, 88.6% of Florida is abnormally dry right now. Next slide, please. Sea level rise is also underway. Sea level rise rates have accelerated along most North American coasts in the last 3 decades. There are approximately 15 million Floridians living in coastal areas, so this is a big concern for the state. Sea level rise is combining with severe storms and hurricanes to intensify flooding events. And together, the sea level rise and severe storm combination cause coastal erosion, shoreline retreat, and beach loss, as well as damaging infrastructure. This combination is also increasing flooding in ports and harbors, which hampers trade and causes cascading impacts to inland markets. This also raises the risk of environmental damage when flooding of coastal industrial sites happens. Sea level rise projections also say that most coral reefs, mangroves, and salt marshes won't be able to move inland or adjust to keep up with sea level rise. So in response, human communities are using a lot of hard engineered structures, as well as beach renourishment, and accommodating some of the flooding and relocating some activities. There are trade-offs associated with each of these approaches. There's no single approach that's perfect, and they all have different lifetimes and limits of effectiveness. Next slide, please. Stronger hurricanes have increased globally in the last 40 years, and hurricanes in the US are making landfall more slowly. This increases the rainfall that they're offering onto the land, and it increases the flooding and damage to built infrastructure. A really big interaction here is the built environment. Building codes have been getting stronger to protect buildings from storm damage, but more development is also happening in exposed areas, and that somewhat counteracts the benefit of better building. Like with sea level rise adaptation, there's financial and technical limits to what can actually be done to the built environment. Climate change is actually projected to magnify the impact of tropical cyclones and hurricanes in the United States and Puerto Rico by increasing rainfall, wind speed, and that slow speed of landfall. The coastal region that's at severe risk from tropical storms is actually projected to expand northward into the United States Northeast area. Next slide, please. So salinity intrusion is also happening partly as a result of sea level rise. It's partly also because of withdrawal of groundwater. As we withdraw groundwater, it changes the way that sea level rise and saltwater and freshwater interact. And this can accelerate how quickly saltwater comes underneath the land and decreases freshwater supplies. This has very serious impacts for the availability of drinking water, as well as for agriculture. In some places in the world, soil is even becoming too salty to grow crops. Next slide, please. This is a big one for Florida. A lot of attention is on water quality. Changing coastal water use, changes in salinity, nutrient levels, temperature, and acidity as a result of the combination of human use and climate change are changing water quality overall, and this favors the success of different species. Some of the species that are being favored are toxic algal species growing in the coastal zone. Climate change is also expected to decrease seafood safety by favoring aquatic pathogens like Vibrio and promoting flood events that spread pollution and pathogens, and also increasing the toxicity of those harmful algal blooms. Next slide, please. So sensitive coastal ecosystems like mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrasses are really experiencing a lot of harm from heat waves, storms, biodiversity change, and nearby coastal development. There are tipping points that are being approached where these environments will be changing so much that they can't be easily restored, and the benefits they provide will be very different from what human communities are used to. As I mentioned before, these systems on the whole will not be too successful at moving inland faster than sea level rise, well past about 2050. These environments, though, are important. They're part of our nature-based solutions toolkit. Sustaining these systems provides important nursery for coastal species, water purification, and even flood protection. And so the more we wait to cut overall greenhouse gas emissions, the more likely it is that these species will go underwater within the next generation. Next slide, please. Corals are some of the most commonly discussed marine species in danger. They're already experiencing bleaching and death from heat waves and water quality. The consequences of coral loss and bleaching include decreased coastal protection, decreased fisheries and tourism, and there's also evidence that the severity of flooding is increasing because losing corals and sea level rise together are changing the overall topography of the coastal seafloor. As an example of what we're up against, the recreation value of coral reef tourism is expected to decrease in Florida and Puerto Rico by 90% by mid-century in the highest greenhouse gas emission scenario. So remember that coral reef tourism is a portion of that $56 billion in ocean-related revenue that Florida gets each year. So this is serious business for Florida. Next slide, please. On average, marine species are moving toward the poles at about 60 kilometers per decade to find ideal temperature conditions to grow in. This is changing the accessibility of species. Tropical locations, are losing species, while subtropical areas are gaining species because the species are moving from tropical locations to poleward. Warming is also causing seasonal events like spring fish reproduction to happen 3 or 4 days earlier every decade. And these changes can interrupt the way species interact with each other and the way that we relate to them too. Some fisheries can adapt with the fishermen traveling farther, but in the United States, there's a really high risk of social inequity arising from these climate-driven changes in fishing, especially when we consider the species that indigenous peoples and local communities depend on. Next slide, please. Human well-being and tourism are something that are familiar to almost all of us. Climate impacts really threaten coastal tourism infrastructure. They submerge beaches, erode walking paths along coasts, and they really impact the attractiveness of different destinations. And this changes tourism demand and affects recreation-based economies. So warm weather tourism activities, fortunately, have a little bit more time than cold weather tourism activities to adapt. But when we think about that 30% of hotels along the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean Sea are exposed to flooding, and 66% of them are located on eroding beaches, we can see how serious this could be to some of our tourism-dependent economies. At the same time, as I mentioned, coral reef cover around Florida and the Gulf of Mexico is decreasing. Overall, climate impacts have really affected human well-being in subtle ways in the United States. Mental health is actually suffering as a result of climate impacts. There's higher rates of anxiety, grief, loss, fear, despair, and even cultural loss related to these extreme weather events and expecting other climate-driven events. So all of this is a little bit hard to take, which is why I'm thrilled that the research that I did also focused on the solution set. Next slide, please. The solution set has 2 parts. As I mentioned before, we know there are more opportunities to save what we love after we strongly cut greenhouse gas emissions. Already there's been progress. In 2008, it looked like the worst case scenario that scientists could dream up with was still too low. But by 2021, the projection is that we're looking at a more middle of the road global emissions scenario. It takes time to bend the curve and make change, but we are making change. Now, the solution set that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that I contributed to focused on looked at adaptation. Now, this is a fairly technical figure from the report that really focuses on what the adaptation solution set looks like. And what's important to take away from this figure is that there are 3 main categories of adaptation activities that are related to ocean and coastal ecosystems. The first is adaptations related to society and institutions. The next is adaptations related to technological developments. And then the third is the use of nature to help us create solutions. We also know that successful solutions will address many problems at once and not just one problem at a time. So successful solutions are also going to spread benefits and risks across different groups and making sure that these risks and benefits are not borne unevenly by groups with different privileges. So successful solutions also draw from all three solution types. And we also know that inclusive solutions that are developed with many stakeholders at the table, so to speak, tend to be the most durable and successful. And so with that, I'm going to pass the baton to JP, who's going to talk about how all of these impacts and solutions are playing out in the Florida context. JP?
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for that really comprehensive presentation. And you're a very hard act to follow for sure. But I will do my best to drill down some more on the Florida coastal environment and what makes Florida so unique, so special, and so much a test ground really for what's happening across the rest of the United States, especially, but what can be pioneered in Florida and what we're seeing in Florida and how that can be impactful elsewhere, globally even. So next slide, please. So when we think about Florida, the first thing that comes to mind for so many people is water. Florida is shot through with water from its limestone karst topography. There's these amazing aquifers that permeate beautiful water through our springs, which are liquid bowls of light. They're like gems. And if any of you folks have never been to a Florida spring, I highly encourage you to go because it's a life-changing experience for some. But that water shoots up through the state. It pours out into our rivers, into our iconic rivers like the St. Johns River or the Kissimmee River or the Apalachicola River. So many of these rivers that are really a part of the Floridian fabric and identity. And that river, that water flows out to the oceans and coasts, by way of our amazing Everglades, which are an iconic wilderness that fosters so much biodiversity, by way of these amazing estuaries like Florida Bay or like Biscayne Bay, Tampa Bay, the Indian River Lagoon, Apalachicola Bay. The state is rife with these sorts of aquatic treasures. And then of course we go out to the ocean itself. Got the Florida Coral Reef Tract, that spans 300 miles down the southeast Florida coast, from Martin County to the Dry Tortuga. Is really an unrivaled wilderness, the third largest barrier reef on the planet, actually, after the Mesoamerican Reef in Central America and the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. So these are our Floridian aquatic assets, from the in-stream resources, from the inland resources, all the way downstream to what's going on in our oceans and off our coasts. And people are moving to Florida at a rate of 1,000 people a day are moving to Florida to take advantage of this iconic wilderness that we all love. It's not just the sunshine, it's those beaches. It's the 800 miles of beaches that fringe the state. Florida is second only to Alaska in terms of coastline. So it's got the most coastline in the contiguous United States. And you can't be more than 60 miles from a beach. And as Sarah pointed out, there are huge financial impacts from a healthy beach, and tens of millions of tourists visiting on a daily basis. So Florida really is a maritime state deeply connected to its ocean. And those of us that live here know that, and those that are coming here know that, and they're coming for that reason. Next slide, please. But in as much as we all love that ocean, we know that the ocean is coming and it's changing the fundamental Floridian way of life. For many years here in Florida, climate change was actually prohibited language at the state government level. The previous governor, Governor Scott, prevented state Florida Department of Environmental Protection employees from using the phrase climate change. But the fact is, Floridians know that the climate is changing. We only have to look in our backyards to see that the water is creeping ever higher up the seawall. In St. Petersburg, I've seen manatees eating people's lawns in their backyards, creeping up and actually nibbling on the grass. I mean, that's partially attributable to king tide events, but king tides are becoming more severe as the water levels are rising. Floridians can see this firsthand, and it's something that we're all going to have to reckon with as it alters our way of life. So next slide, please. I think that one of the key canaries in the coal mine is the Florida manatee and what's happening with this species that is such a gentle and lovely animal, and anyone who's been anywhere near Florida's coast has seen a manatee, I'm sure. And you know, they really are, I've used this word iconic, but they are iconic. When you think of Florida, you think of manatees, you think of dolphins, you think of sea turtles, you think of a few other things, but manatees are one of those key species that that indicate a healthy Floridian coastline. But in the past year, and actually a little more than a year, we've lost around 1,100 manatees, more than 1,100 manatees out of a population of around 6,000. We're averaging around, we're looking at around 15% total loss in manatees over the last year plus a few months. In just the past 2 months, we've lost around 375 manatees. Mostly those manatees are dying due to starvation, and they're starving to death because seagrass is dying off by the tens of thousands of acres in these key estuaries. The Indian River Lagoon, for example, is a key estuary where we've had tens of thousands of acres of seagrass die off. The seagrass is dying because of harmful algal blooms occluding the water column and prohibiting the growth of seagrass, which is, like any other plant, relying on sunlight to thrive. The harmful algal blooms, which Dr. Cooley pointed out, are being fueled by warming water temperatures in addition to excessive nutrient inputs attributable to growth and mismanagement of water quality in Florida. But that warming water component really is like pouring gasoline on the harmful algal bloom fire. And whether that's a red tide event or a blue-green algal bloom event, that has deleterious impacts on something that a lot of folks aren't thinking about, which is manatees. Next slide, please. I think it's important for folks to realize that a manatee, an individual manatee, which weighs as much as 1,000 pounds, is going to eat 10% of its weight in seagrass on any given day. So that means one manatee might eat as much as 100 pounds of seagrass in a single day. You know, multiply that by the 6,000 manatees we've got, and, you know, add in the fact that we've lost tens of thousands of acres of seagrass. It's no surprise that they're starving to death. And it's really no surprise that manatees are this canary in the coal mine for the twofold water quality and climate crisis that Florida is staring down. Next slide, please. And you can see on this map, this is current as of last August, actually, but it's a good map because it sort of shows the heat of where the relative heat of where the most number of manatees are being picked up. And you can see on the east coast of Florida there, the east central coast, that's the Indian River Lagoon, basically spanning around northern Brevard County down to Martin County, roughly. That's where we've seen the greatest number of manatee losses, but you also see significant losses there in southwest Florida, off of Cape Coral, Peace River, Caloosahatchee River estuaries. That's an area where there has been, you know, thousands of acres of seagrass lost, and also, you know, 2018, we saw a red tide event off the coast of southwest Florida that was equivalent to the size of the state of Connecticut in geographic area, just sitting there hovering off the southwest Florida coast. Of course, just last summer in 2021, Tampa Bay saw the worst red tide event since 1971, right there in the bay, but also lingering around down to Southwest Florida and spanning a huge, multi-county area along the west central Florida and Southwest Florida coasts. Next slide, please. In addition to these water quality crises that we've been seeing affecting manatees, there have been these calamities that have become very keenly in the public eye. And I think no calamity was greater last year than the Piney Point catastrophe on the south side of Tampa Bay. Piney Point is a combination of a couple of phosphogypsum stacks, which are a way of dealing with tailings from the phosphate mining industry. A lot of folks don't know that Florida is a huge exporter of phosphates, mostly overseas, to create fertilizer. That fertilizer actually, which is exported, the phosphates exported to China, they turn it into fertilizer and we re-import it to use on our crops. Florida is a huge part of that trade. And the phosphogypsum stacks, mostly around Tampa Bay, but also in the Bone Valley area, which is the headwaters of the Peace River. These phosphogypsum stacks are kind of dotting the landscape, and the giant hills that are hollow and filled with this mining slurry, you could call it, which is nutrient rich. It's filled with nitrogen and phosphorus. It's also radioactive. It's got uranium in it from the mining process. And what happened at Piney Point was this reservoir basically failed, and it leaked into Piney Point Creek and into Tampa Bay ultimately. In this picture, you can actually see, if you look at the top left center of the picture, that little skyline back there is St. Petersburg, directly across Tampa Bay. Some 400 million plus gallons of this nutrient-rich, radioactive, toxic wastewater ended up in Tampa Bay. And as we know, these nutrient inputs into marine ecosystems have a tendency to fuel harmful algal blooms. And while the science is still being connected, and researchers at the University of Florida, Center for Coastal Solutions, and the Tampa Bay Estuary Program and the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program are trying to make the connection between the leak at Piney Point and the 2021 red tide event. I think for many of us lay people, that connection is very clear. And if you go to the next slide, you can see where those nutrients ended up in Tampa Bay and how they emanated through the Bay ecosystem as well as into the Gulf ecosystem. That's a model from the University of South Florida's College of Marine Science that's showing right there at Piney Point where that yellow epicenter is. That's where the spill occurred. And we can see that that model is putting the nutrients from Piney Point all throughout the bay and out into the Gulf. And we can remember that the red tide event was at its most severe right there in that portion of Tampa Bay, and then back up into the bay, of course, and offshore. And it spread up and down the coast, all the way up to the Nature Coast and all the way down to Southwest Florida as far as Naples last year. So next slide, please. We saw that red tide event fueling these massive fish kills, and fish kills have become commonplace for us in Florida. This is a Goliath grouper, an animal that can get to 800 pounds and 8 feet long. And it succumbed to the red tide event last year. This is in St. Petersburg. I believe it's up by Weeden Island for folks who know that area. But you know, this fish kill is driven by a warming water situation that is fueling the severity of harmful algal blooms like red tide. And it's all interconnected, and it's something that, you know, pulls at your heartstrings when you see this giant creature being lifted up by a caterpillar and disposed of. But it's important to make those connections and realize that this animal is succumbed because of a warming climate, and because of too many nutrient inputs going into Florida's waters. And it's these things that we need to work on fixing if we want to prevent this kind of catastrophe from continuing to happen. Next slide, please. And again, this is a dolphin, and I hate to bring the gruesome and gory pictures, but I mean, I think that a picture tells, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and this is especially true looking at dolphins who are succumbing to the red tide event. And, red tide can be impactful to all kinds of marine mammals and fish. The next slide is also a tragic picture. So if you click to that one, you'll see, a green turtle that is just washed up on St. Pete Beach. And this animal died as a result of the red tide event last summer. So, I think when people are seeing an event like red tide or blue-green algal blooms, on the Caloosahatchee River, we need to think of Lake Okeechobee discharges for sure. We need to think of our own septic fields and our own municipal discharges into our local waterways, but we also need to think about mitigation efforts that are needed to work to combat, this warming climate that really is making these water quality events way worse. Next slide, please. And again, on that blue-green algal point, we've talked about the Caloosahatchee a bit, but, the hydrology of Lake Okeechobee has been so fundamentally altered, predominantly by agricultural and development interests on the south side of the lake. The Everglades agricultural area has really been a major changer of the way the flow of water should be out of Lake Okeechobee. That water in Lake Okeechobee should flow through the Everglades and out to Biscayne Bay and the Florida Bay as clean, fresh water. Instead, because we're reserving that water at levels that can be usable for agriculture and for other downstream uses, for South Florida in particular, we're discharging nutrient-laden water through the St. Lucie River and through the Caloosahatchee. This picture shows you exactly what nutrient-rich water from Lake Okeechobee does once it gets warmed up and makes its way out to the coast. You get these massive blue-green algal events that can cause fish kills, that can be toxic, they contain microcystin, that can injure animals, that can also be very impactful to human health. Next slide, please. I can't see it. There it is. And we've talked about Southwest Florida, Tampa Bay, Lake Okeechobee, Caloosahatchee, and the St. Lucie rivers. South Florida, a lot here, but another waterway that's suffering in Florida in almost the exact same way is the St. Johns River. And this is the river that starts in Brevard County in Lake Washington or Lake Helen Blazes, and it flows northward, becoming a major river, ultimately flowing right through downtown Jacksonville and out into the Atlantic Ocean at Mayport. And it's a tidal river with tremendous biodiversity, lots of tidal interchange and marine species interacting with freshwater species, but it too is suffering from warming temperatures and excessive nutrients, fueling these harmful algal events that ultimately kill manatees, kill fish, et cetera, and harm the human environment. Next slide, please. So just thinking a little bit more about the impacts of rising waters and climate resilience on the built environment and on the human environment, and the nexus in Florida of the human environment with the marine environment, I think this picture also tells an important story. This is in Miami Beach, one of the major skyrise type buildings that you see if you just wander through Miami Beach. This is the parking garage below the building, and this is a little octopus that has made its way up through the drainage of that building during a king tide event and is wallowing around on the floor of that parking garage. I think this really tells a story of, the unnatural alterations that we've made by changing our climate. And, I think no story tells a more grim kind of telling of the impacts of rising seas than what happened at the Surfside condominium collapse. You can see that if you've got water in your parking garage, and this is salt water, it's penetrating that cement, and it's going to penetrate the steel reinforcements that are holding that building up. This is, I think, sadly, the Surfside collapse is a real eye-opener for a lot of people as to how fragile and delicate some of the amazing structures that we've built along the Florida coast really are, and how impactful the rising sea is going to be on that built environment. Next slide, please. Also thinking about the impacts of sea level rise on the natural environment. This is Big Pine Key in the Florida Keys after Hurricane Irma swept through. And these are mangrove trees that have been completely denuded of their foliage. And that we're basically losing the ecosystem services of as a result of a major hurricane. Hurricane seasons are becoming more severe. The last 2 hurricane seasons we've had in the North Atlantic, we've run out of names and had to start over again with the Greek alphabet, I think it is, in order to actually name these storms. And the point is warming waters are driving more severe storm seasons and producing more frequent and severe hurricane type weather. That's going to be impactful for the natural environment, where we're losing mangrove forests to storms that don't immediately bounce back after a storm, that we may have some permanent loss of, and that may get hammered storm after storm after storm, and will maybe never have a chance to return. And that's just going to have an exponential effect on the buffering, natural storm buffering services that these types of habitats provide. Next slide. But the storms also are obviously going to impact human environments. And, this is Bluntstown, Florida, which folks probably don't know, but it's in the Panhandle, it's west of Tallahassee. And this is about 45 miles inland from the Gulf Coast. This was after Hurricane Michael came on shore. And this actually would have been a pine plantation. So this was someone's agricultural livelihood, a good 45 miles from the coast. And yet Hurricane Michael came in, ravaged the coast, and continued to do huge damage this far inland, absolutely devastating a huge portion of the agrarian economy in that portion of the state. We're just going to be seeing more and more of that as water temperatures continue to rise and these storm seasons continue to become more severe. So next slide. That's a lot of doom and gloom and a lot of tragedies that we're facing down, from manatees to water quality to increasingly severe storm seasons to condo collapses to, the upheaval of the human and natural environment. And I got to tell you, I wouldn't be doing this work if I wasn't optimistic that, we can have some meaningful positive changes, and that Florida is an amazing laboratory for producing some of these changes. I think it's worth noting that, Florida has traditionally been a swing state. And, you might argue that it's becoming less purple and more conservative red. But I think that the fact that we're producing positive wins for the environment, positive wins on things like water quality, on resilience, hopefully ultimately on mitigation, as well as adaptation for a changing environment. And climate, I think really that proof is in the pudding, that if you can do it in Florida in a conservative climate, you can export that model elsewhere. And it really doesn't matter from which end of the political spectrum you come. We need an all hands on deck approach to be tackling these really existential problems that Florida is in so many ways facing head on and facing first. So I wanted to just give some updates as to what happened in the legislative session this year, which just ended on March 14th, actually. And there were certainly some wins for the environment and certainly some losses as well. Notably, there was a resilience package that came across the finish line that will establish a chief resilience officer for the state of Florida permanently. Some of these other things, I can go into more detail on if there's some specific questions, and I know we need to move on. But I also wanted to note that we were, tying it back to Manatees, we successfully disabled and dismantled a piece of legislation that would have made it easier for developers to destroy seagrasses in Florida. That was just the absolute wrong time for that legislation to be brought. It was the seagrass mitigation banking legislation, which sounds good on its face, but in reality was sort of a license to developers to destroy native seagrasses using untested and unproven science to plant new seagrasses that really probably would have a net loss of those wild seagrasses and their associated ecosystem services. So I see from our moderators that we have some questions and that we kind of need to move on in order to wrap up. So I'll end there, but I'm happy to take questions offline or answer specific questions as they come up. And thanks for the opportunity to present.
Well, thank you so much, JP and Sarah. I don't want to cut the conversation short, but we do want to field some questions from the audience. So I have a couple here, and if you want to answer them, we'll try to get through a couple of them before we wrap up. One of them is that you have mentioned on numerous occasions that we've made a lot of environmental degradation in the state, our water quality and the sea level rising. And the question is, are we past the tipping point? Like, can we recover? And what are the steps that would get us to reverse this trend? Are we too far gone, or can we still return things back? And how would we do that?
I'll take a whack at that, JP, and then you can add Florida to-dos. How about that?
Yeah.
We are not at all past any point of no return. Just the diversity of habitats and ecosystems that exist in Florida, and the sheer vibrancy of Florida ecosystems means that there's a lot to work with. We absolutely need to be taking decisive action now. One of the themes that just struck me as I listened to JP's comments was how much the outcomes in Florida are a combination of climate impacts and the outcomes of human choices. A lot of the harmful algal blooms in Florida have been discovered to be specifically tied to nutrient releases or runoff from Florida. And those have everything to do with our local choices. At the same time, we know that warming temperatures are making individual harmful algal bloom species more toxic, but human decisions are paving the way for these species to thrive in the first place. And that's something that can be changed. We can talk a little bit about the solution set in a minute, but one of the things that JP grapples with every day is how to prioritize first actions for greatest impact. JP, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I also just wanted to note that, I don't think we're past the tipping point, because I think you just have to look back in Florida history, and anyone who's been here for longer than, a decade or two can tell you that there were situations in the past where the Floridian environment was completely and utterly devastated. And by virtue of our interventions, we've brought some of those environments back from the cusp or even from total devastation. And I think in particular of some stories like the Kissimmee River, for example, had been channelized and turned into this straight shot of water north of Lake Okeechobee. And it's been recently, after we broke those channelizations out and turned the river back into its natural meander, that you're seeing a lot of restoration of ecosystem services and a lot of wildlife returning back to its natural places. Even the Indian River Lagoon, which I've mentioned, has been so devastated and has lost so much acreage of seagrass and is really on the cusp of a maybe nearly irreversible decline, had been in the course of history at the brink before. You know, in the 1960s, it had become so nutrient laden that it was basically a festering cesspool. And, you know, through interventions, through water quality reforms, we were able to bring it back. And I'm hopeful that we can do the same again, but you need some really powerful action, especially on that water quality piece, but obviously on the warming climate piece in order to actually make a difference.
Okay, so a follow-up question to that, or more specifically, we know that the nutrients are partially coming from septic, partially coming from public discharge, and also coming from fertilizer discharge. And there have been some local legislation put in place in terms of fertilizer. Is it effective? Is it enough? And it, you know, what would you recommend? Do we have to tighten it, and how would we do that?
So there are a little more than, I think, 130 fertilizer ordinances in local and municipal governments in Florida. Put that into perspective, there are 67 counties in the state, and, you know, a county like Miami-Dade County has 32 municipalities. So I mean, like, the scale, you know, there's still a lot of progress that needs to be made in terms of implementing these fertilizer ordinances, but those fertilizer ordinances can be very effective, especially if deployed across a long enough season, especially to encompass hurricane season. And you really need to make them run, you know, from at least, say, May, June till at least October, November. Many of them stop too early and they'll stop in, say, September. But we know in Florida, we get some of our rainiest weather in September and in October, and that rain is just going to flush the fertilizer off into our coastal ecosystems. Additionally, we know that as the climate continues to change, we're going to have rainier weather longer into the year and starting earlier. And so having a broader swath of time for those fertilizer ordinances is going to be needed.
Okay, Sarah, this question is probably for you. We have a question about the successes of restoring coral reefs that have been bleached out. You know, how successful are there? What can be done at scale? We know there are a lot of small groups doing experimental stuff, but, you know, given the size of the problem, what's our best strategy?
Sure. Well, it's important to remember that bleached coral is not necessarily dead. Bleached corals sometimes do recover, especially when waters cool and the stresses decline long enough for the corals to actually recover. But it's true that a lot of bleached corals don't survive. So a bleached coral you can think of as being, you know, on life support or something like that. When corals do die, there are a number of options that coral biologists are working on to, you may have heard about some of the work happening in Florida at Mote Marine Laboratory to breed a heat-resistant corals and to plant them out after they've reached a certain age, a certain size to be able to survive in the wild environment. There's a lot of work happening around that kind of thing, around ways to help make reefs more resilient during marine heat waves. All that work is really at an experimental level. And so it's not ready to be scaled up right now. It's not cost effective or technically ready to be scaled up. But there's some promise and some hope when it comes to what's going on with the selective breeding and the they call it coral gardening, which I just love. And so I think that's important. But at the same time, going back to the concept of the bleached corals, because the bleached coral is hanging in the balance, we need to take every effort to not add more stressors to those corals. We need to be making sure that they aren't getting a full load of nutrient overloading. They're not also suffering from breakage, from people accidentally driving boats or into corals or walking over them. there are absolutely preventable, things are preventable that would tip a bleached coral into a dead coral. The heating question is tough, but we can absolutely be reducing those other stressors.
So another question that came, I guess we'll move from the middle of the ocean toward the land. We'll do a transect. There's been some writing about regions of our oceans that are basically running out of oxygen, hypoxic zones, and how that's impacting fish. And you had mentioned that fish are moving northward. How bad are these hypoxic areas? We know that there's one somewhere in the center of the Gulf. And what can we do about that? Is that a permanent thing, or can we fix that?
Well, we're just learning more about the extent of hypoxia and how permanent some of these places are. We do know that with increased warming, and increased warming also dampens the vertical mixing that naturally happens in the ocean. So with warming, we tend to have less vertical mixing. We get more risk of these hypoxic events, and they last. And that's a really serious concern. There is evidence of fish species moving, to areas where they do have abundant oxygen. But I think the story is just beginning to be written on how oxygen changes in the ocean are going to affect marine species overall. But it's disturbing.
Another question from somebody actually abroad who asks, what is the human impact of plastics on the floor of the ocean? And how is that related, or is that related to the climate issue?
JP, I think you could probably talk about what's being done in Florida on the plastics front. But in general, I can say two things. One thing is plastic pollution is another human-caused stress on marine life. But at the same time, the production of plastics releases a lot of carbon dioxide emissions. Fossil fuels are the source material for plastics. Even if plastics are recycled or incinerated so they don't reach the ocean, they are still contributing to carbon dioxide emissions. So plastics are a major, major contributor to additional warming. So in that way, they're connected to adding to climate change, but the end product of plastic waste is also a harmful stress on marine life. JP knows a lot more about what's being done specifically in Florida to solve marine plastic problems.
Yeah, and to that point, the legislature just passed a bill that will give local governments the power to ban cigarette smoking on their public beaches. So bear with me because this ties into plastic. Cigarette filters are fundamentally little bound up strands of cellulose acetate, which is in itself a form of plastic. Cigarette butts are on Florida beaches during the International Coastal Cleanup, which ocean conservancies run for more than 30 years. And they've been the #1 item for 30 years. So cigarette butts, in as much as they're a tiny little thing that we don't really think about much, are a major source of plastic pollution on Florida beaches. And Florida communities now have an opportunity to get that plastic debris off of their beaches and have a meaningful impact for wildlife. One thing I would note is that sea turtles are impacted by microplastic, can act as sink that will actually alter the temperature of as the eggs in the sand. Temperature is critically important for sea turtle hatchlings because it determines the sex ratio of the species. And so if your sex ratios are askew, you're going to affect the overall reproductivity of sea turtles. And so there's a good reason to get plastics out of Florida sand, and start cigarette butts is probably a pretty good idea.
Okay, I think we'll have time for at least one more question. You talked quite a bit and showed some devastating pictures of the mangroves. And we know that with sea level rise, their roots are going to get drowned out and they need to move landward. But we have a lot of coastal development that you pointed out. and more assets all the time along our coasts. So what are the land use strategies that localities or even communities can start thinking about to allow for mangroves to be able to move and migrate inland to offer the buffering that they do?
Yeah, I'll take a start at that and pass it off to Sarah. But yes, mangroves are a walking tree, right? They will go wherever they can take hold. And we're actually seeing that firsthand in the Everglades, where mangroves are moving up from the coast and overtaking freshwater habitat. We actually don't want that to happen. We need those freshwater ecosystem services to be preserved. So that is a sidebar on the unfair impact of climate change. What can local communities do in terms of planning? Well, we can make investments in green infrastructure and in putting, plantations of mangroves, for example, at the forefront, on an even footing, even with some of the gray infrastructure investments that we're seeing needed. The city of Miami Beach, for example, is slated to spend $400 million in gray infrastructure investments by 2030 just to keep their streets above sea level. But they should also be looking at strategies for planting mangrove and giving mangrove the space it needs to thrive to provide the buffering services that will also help keep those roads from being washed away. But I'll pass it over to Sarah if she has anything interesting on that one.
No, I think that was great, JP. That was super locally relevant. In general, I think it's important to keep in mind that, we can't be thinking about mangroves only when it comes to, what the problem is that mangroves face, right? JP gave a great example of thinking about not only the mangroves, but also the freshwater ecosystems and also the hard, built environment. And so it's really important to develop solutions that are locally appropriate that combine the interests of all of these entities, the natural environment, the social environment, and future generations too. And when we're thinking specifically about sea level rise, the temptation is to just kind of put up seawalls everywhere. But there's a limit to how effective seawalls can be. And seawall building and hard engineering has a limit to how effective it is, and it has trade-offs. If we build a seawall, it doesn't do anything to help sustain mangroves because they need green space, they need natural spaces, they don't just need concrete next to them. And I have a good colleague who's a specialist in sea level rise planning, and she always points out that instead of thinking about moving away from the coast, we need to think about providing development and attractions inland for people to develop towards. So we want to be attracting people to human settlements together that don't represent a failure. It represents an aspiration or a combination of things that the natural system needs and the human system needs, rather than just thinking, oh, well, gee, I guess we got washed out of the coastline. It's a shift in mentality to think about moving towards something better inland that's a multidimensional solution.
Well, thank you both very much for all of this valuable information and for answering all those questions with such thoughtfulness. I'm going to ask Katie to cue up the end of our discussion. So several of you at the beginning of this presentation had been writing on the chat. So how do we engage with Growing Climate Solutions, and how can we all support each other and advance this joint effort to advance climate action? And so the first thing I say is, if you haven't already, join Growing Climate Solutions newsletter list. You can find out more information about our organization at www.growingclimatesolutions.org. I also ask that we keep following on social media, Facebook and Twitter and even Instagram. So follow us on those sites and repost the information that we post to your friends and your family, because it's really wonderful that all of you came here and learned, but we have to extend that knowledge to our friends, our families, our neighbors. We have to get more people climate aware and climate engaged, because it's going to take all of us to sort of change those systemic policies, to put pressure on our community leaders to invest the resources needed to right this ship. We also ask if anyone on the call is leading an organization and wants to become a partner of Growing Climate Solutions. There's no financial commitment. What we have is sort of an engagement strategy. So reach out to me in the coming days via email, and we can talk more about partnerships. We love to grow our list of partners, and that also expands our following in Florida to diverse audiences. Next slide, please. And also to look out for our events. So I want to put a plug for the next Climate Compass event, which will be April 13th, same time, 4 o'clock on a Wednesday. We are having the Global Sustainability Director for Ford Motor Company coming to talk to us about Ford Motor Company's strategy for electric vehicles in the US market and abroad. We also have other programming opportunities, our Why and How series. So come and join us for more of our events. And most importantly, you will receive at the end of this call in about 10, 15 minutes, a short survey. We would love you to fill out that survey and tell us what you thought about the program. It helps us plan more exciting content, and it really helps us sort of support our mission. So please don't ignore that. It's a short survey, and we hope that you'll all participate and give us really candid feedback. And next slide, please. Finally, I really want to thank our funding partners, the Community Foundation of Collier County, the Collaboratory, Conservancy, and Gulf Coast, and a very, very special thank you to the Naples Daily News, and News Press, Local IQ, and WGCU for their sponsorship of this. They have provided us invaluable help in getting the word out. So once again, thank you to all of our funding partners and our media sponsors. And we really hope that you enjoyed it and will join us for other events on April 13th. Hope to see you on April 13th, everyone. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful afternoon.